Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's session. We are going to have a talk given by Mr. Tim Beardson, the author of Stumbling Giant, The Threats of China's Future. I think this is a very eye-catching title. I think everybody is interested in how the China will be in the next maybe 10 years. I think you have the CV of the speaker, very extensive CV. I'm not going to repeat it, but just want to point out that Tim is a very successful investment banker, and his investment bank was the first one in China. And Tim told me that he went into China since 1978, basically covering all the reform period, and he had a lot of first-hand experience in China. And he's going to talk about a wide range of topics today. I think in his book he covered the upgrading of manufacturing sector, the environmental issue, the dysfunctionality financial system, or maybe defective welfare structure, and the evolving role of party, etc. So let's put our hands together to welcome the speaker, Mr. Beardson.
Professor Chen, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. Maybe before I start talking about this book, I ought to just make a few general observations. The first thing is that most people who write about China tend to write about it as an economic subject. A few people write about China in foreign affairs terms or maybe in political terms. What I thought would be interesting is to look at the future of China through a number of different lenses. I've looked at education, I've looked at culture, morality, the future of the Chinese language. I've looked at social changes, as well as the environment, economics, politics. There are many different ways of looking at what are the factors that will affect China in the future. One point that readily comes to mind when we think about China is that people who comment on China like to say how many things there are that are going very well, or how many things there are that are going very badly. But when we realize that China, of course, has 4.5 times the population of the United States, it's not really at all relevant unless we're saying that China has 10 times as many good things or 10 times as many bad things. We have to put things into context all the time with China because it is such a large and diverse place. Another point is that the data in China are always frail. A very good example of this is GDP. People like to talk about China's GDP results, what it means, and the trends that are taking place. But we must all the time realize that we know very, very little about the numbers in China. So when a Wall Street trader becomes very excited that China's GDP is 7.4, it's rather comic, because not only do we not know the 0.4, we actually don't know whether it's 7 or not. And not only do we not know, but the government doesn't know. One of the problems in this situation is that if you motivate officials based on targets, like you must achieve this level of GDP, and those officials have influence over the statistics, you will generally achieve the targets. So we can either have targets or we can have truth, but it's very difficult to get both. And this happens in many areas of China, and it happens also around the world. I mean, crime statistics in the UK. The police generally meet the crime statistic targets, because they're in charge of the crime reports. I mean, it's a global phenomenon, but it does affect the kind of figures that we're given. China's data are frail throughout the country, whatever it is we look at. So we should broadly assume that they're illustrative of the trends, but they won't necessarily be particularly accurate. A third point is that I've lived in Hong Kong, as Professor Chen said, for about 36 years, and quite a lot of people assume that my book about the future of China is based on what I thought over the last 36 years, people I met, people I talked to, and I've had the benefit of meeting a lot of the policymakers in China over those years and having some quite interesting and robust conversations. But I just make the point that when I sat down to begin this book 3.5 years ago, if I'd written on that day everything that I thought about China's future, the book would have said some very different things. When I actually had to research a lot of the aspects of what I needed to write about, I changed my point of view on a number of areas. Because it's so easy when you live somewhere to fall into the easy assumptions that everybody has about what's happening around you. And it's only when you have to research them specifically in depth and test them against other points of view that you sometimes come out saying, my view was wrong. I needed to form a different point of view. So I changed my view in the course of this book on a number of areas. And the last general point I'll make is that when we talk of China's rise, it's very fashionable to use expressions like the re-emergence of China. Condoleezza Rice said this, Hillary Clinton says it quite a lot, and indeed Henry Kissinger wrote a book recently in which he talked about the re-emergence of China at the center of world affairs. I think we have to stand back at this point and just say China has never been at the center of world affairs. It's never had anything to do with North and South America, with Australasia, with Europe. It's had very little to do with West Asia, and it's had extremely little to do with Africa, apart from some voyages in the 14th century. China has been a very important power in East Asia. It has never been at the center of world affairs. So we sometimes have to look at the way people discuss and frame the conversations. What I think we're seeing is a very, very important trend, which is the emergence of China in a central position in world affairs. And that's well worth discussing. We just have to get the language right. I'm sorry, the lectern doesn't have a flat surface. I'm not going to be able to cover all the themes in this book because unfortunately it's over 500 pages long. What I'd like to do is to just talk about one or two of the most important issues that face China this century. China will have a lot of serious challenges. Most of those are capable of being confronted and dealt with some political will and with the spending of quite a lot of money. But the biggest challenge that China faces, in my opinion, is one that government will find it extremely hard to address. And that's the issue of demography. China's demographic challenge comes in 4 different shapes. Some of these have been talked about quite a lot, and some of them haven't been talked about much at all. The first is the workforce of China. In the early 1970s, China had 27 million births a year. It now has about 16 million births a year. So the number's fallen by 40%. People are choosing to have fewer children. And inevitably and expectedly, this is coming through to tightness of supply in the workforce, and for several years now, wages rising at double digits. We're now beginning to see the fall in numbers coming through to the workforce on a national level. This is not going to stop. This is going to continue because we know how many children have been born, so we know the workforce is going to continue to shrink. This affects the economic model which has driven China's success over the last 30 years of being the low-cost manufacturer to the world. China will need to find an alternative model, and this has been debated in China for quite some time. The discussion is, should it be a domestic consumption-driven model, or should it be an innovation-led model? My suggestion is that domestic consumption will not be the driver of China's future economy in the next few years, because although there are quite a lot of household savings in China, unfortunately the lack of a broad and deep welfare system in China means that those savings will remain saved. They're unlikely to get spent. I think it has to be innovation. But the problem that I see for China is that despite the government having prioritized research and development, innovation strategies for more than 15 years, there is very, very little sign of successful domestic innovation in China. So that's the first challenge that I see. The second challenge comes from the aging of China's society. In 2010, there were just over 100 million people above the age of 65. By 2030, it'll be 320 million, roughly the population of America today. A tripling of the elderly, but the population of the country is growing at 0.45% a year, scarcely growing at all. And the second problem is that the Chinese family is undergoing a significant restructure, because with better health care, people are living longer. So a young working couple today might anticipate having 4 parents alive and possibly even up to 8 grandparents alive, but no siblings. And the ability to adopt traditional cultures of care where the elderly are looked after at home simply isn't practical when you've got up to 12 elderly people in your family. So at the moment, only 1% of the elderly are in any kind of institutional care. I suggest by 2030 this could be 50%. But 50% of a number which has tripled. We could be looking at 150 million people needing state care by 2030. It has a significant budgetary impact. But of course, China may be the second biggest economy in the world, but it has a surprisingly small budget. The United States has a budget of federal, state, and local expenditure of just over 30% of GDP. Western Europe has 40 to 50% of GDP as governmental budget. In China, it's about 22. So whatever the economy does, the budget is really quite small. And what that suggests is that by 2030, we're going to be saying, can we have 6 more aircraft carriers, or do we have to look after 150 million elderly? It may be difficult to do everything. So there are strategic implications to this aging process. The third challenge is gender disparity. For the last 20 years, Chinese people have chosen to have fewer children, in a society like that, with a rural heritage, a Confucian background, the choice has generally been a preference to try to have male children. And we've had 6 boys born for every 5 girls for 20 years. So we know as a matter of fact that in the next 2 decades, there are going to be 40 to 50 million men who are not going to get married. That's more than the population of France. And of course, it doesn't mean that 17% of men don't get married. What it means is that women play a very important part in marriage decisions. And sociologists will tell us that women marry upwards. They marry men who are more affluent, more intelligent, better looking. So what we're going to see is maybe 40% of all Chinese men who are not affluent, not intelligent, ugly, not getting married. These people are going to be inarticulate, they're going to be angry, and they're going to be heading for the cities. And it's already showing up in crime statistics in major Chinese cities. I think 90% of all arrests under the age of 40 are of males. 75% are young single males. They're committing acts of violence, property crime, and so on. This is going to get worse, not better. And it's quite likely to lead to social instability in parts of China, which has an economic impact on the country and on investment and business. There's gender disparity all over the world. It's important in North Africa, it's important in the Indian subcontinent, but it is far more severe in China than it is anywhere else in the world. And I believe it's correct to say that gender disparity in China is worse than that of any society in history. The fourth demographic challenge for China is what's happening to the entire population of the country. I've mentioned that it's still growing, but at a rate of 0.45% per annum. All the demographic forecasts suggest that by the 2030s, the population will have peaked. In the 2020s, it'll be overtaken by India, which will then become the most populous country in the world, which has an effect on foreign direct investment flows, capital flows into India, into China. It'll affect the balance of those numbers. But when China peaks and starts to have a reduced population, there are a series of different forecasts about what's going to happen from then on through the rest of this century. The most conservative forecast is that of the United Nations, which suggests that China will, by 2100, the end of this century, have had a fall in population of approximately 25% to about 1 billion people. Every independent academic forecast is for much steeper falls in China's population, anywhere down to 2/3 reduction, giving China a population of about 530 million, which is roughly what the forecasts are for the population of America by the end of this century. So on some forecasts, we could go from a world today of 4.5 Chinese for every 1 American to a world that could be as much as 1 to 1, which has a strategic impact. And this is based on looking at what's called total fertility rates, how many children a woman might expect to have in her lifetime. And these have been steadily coming down. And that's in many ways a global phenomenon as well. We're seeing it everywhere. But the extent of the fall that can be anticipated in China, even if you just take the middle range between the most cautious and the most sharp, you're looking at a world where China is going to have successive, steep, continual falls in its population decade after decade. And I can't think of any society in history which has had that population profile and has been able to sustain continued high rates of economic growth. So even if China manages to succeed eventually in producing huge amounts of domestic innovation, that will only mitigate what is happening on the population front. And I'd suggest by the 2040s, if they're very lucky with innovation, we might be saying, hasn't China done well this year? It's had GDP growth of 2%. Because it's very difficult to grow at all if your entire population is reducing so much. I think we're more likely to be talking about per capita growth, not growth per country. But then if we're looking at big issues like whether China will replace the United States as the next superpower, the total size of China's economy is important, not necessarily the per capita numbers. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult for China to replace America as a superpower. It may continue to have growth, but that's a very different thing. Occasionally people say, well, surely this is easily addressable. Couldn't China just scrap the one-child policy and then we could see a release of energy? Unfortunately, the one-child policy has had no effect whatever on China's annual rate of births. In 1970, China had a total fertility rate of 5.8, likely number of children a woman might have in her life. By 1980, that had fallen to 2.3. In 10 years, China did what France took 150 years to do. This was nothing to do with the one-child policy. This happened between 1970 and 1980, and the one-child policy came in 1979 and was not fully adopted in its first year or two of operation. So this was happening for completely different causes. Since the one-child policy came in, China's rate of birth has certainly continued to decline. It's now down to about 1.5. But it's declined exactly in line with Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, all of which have sharply falling rates of birth. This is because the same social factors are affecting China as are affecting many other countries in East Asia. People are marrying later in life. They're going from rural environments to urban environments. In many countries, you're having more women in the workforce. You've got environmental factors that are causing a reduction in male fertility. For all sorts of factors, rising real estate prices that mean people don't take 3-bedroom apartments, they take 1-bedroom apartments. You only have to look at Shanghai, where the birth rate at the moment is between 0.6 and 0.8. It's not being constrained by a one-child policy, because people might prefer to have a BMW rather than a child. It's cheaper to maintain. So I would argue that the one-child policy didn't bring the birth rates down, and scrapping it will not send them up. People are making lifestyle choices in China that they don't want large families. And I don't see what the government's going to do to change that. Urbanization is a particularly important factor in reducing population growth. There was a paper recently in Ghana that it had helped to reduce population growth in Ghana. It's a worldwide feature. It's been ascribed as the reason for 22% of fall in China's birth rate. And the Chinese government not only acknowledges that China is urbanizing extremely fast, it wants to speed it up. In that environment, we're not going to get birth rates rising. So I think we have to get used to a very different socioeconomic picture for China. How much time have we got? 5 minutes. I might just talk about two other challenges, if there's the time for that. One is education and innovation. Why isn't China innovating? I mean, Chinese people seem highly successful in Silicon Valley. They seem unsuccessful in China. There are structural reasons for that, I'd suggest. I think the education system is not producing critical thinking. We're simply not seeing the unleashing of potential. And that's perfectly possible to change. But it does require a willingness to open up the education system to debate, to argument. It requires a very different approach. And at the moment, we don't see that. There's also a culture of deference in the scientific community. The oldest scientist is right, the most senior guy is always right, and this is not the environment in which you create innovation. There are a lot of things that could change. I mean, China may be the second largest economy, but it doesn't have one university in the top 100 in the world. And it's built a university every 3 days for the last 8 years. It has far too many. It has 7 million graduates a year, but it has graduate unemployment of over 40%. China just doesn't know how to produce graduates or what to do with them. A lot of things have to change in education to produce innovation. The financial system I describe in the book as being dysfunctional, and I'll give a couple of examples of that. One is that in 1980, 3% of China's economy was private sector. Now it's 65%. But fewer than 20% of all bank loans go to the private sector. So the banking system is not doing what you would expect it to do to get optimal economic results. People have noticed around the world China's reported growth rates of 10% a year. Whether they're 10% or 8% doesn't really matter very much. But they've noticed China's produced high rates of reported growth. And they've wanted to invest. They're rather disappointed that the Chinese stock market today is at the same level it was in the year 2000. The stock market in no way has generated capital growth that reflects the economic growth that's reported. And one of the principal reasons for that is that 85% of the stock market by value is state enterprises, and that's not where the growth is. So you've got dysfunctionality wherever you look in the financial system. This can be changed, but at the moment, the financial system in China is dysfunctional if you want to optimize economic results, particularly at a time of the slowing economy. So those are some thoughts. Maybe I ought to stand back. But I'm very happy to talk about foreign affairs, regional affairs, the environment, or future of the party, or anything that people might be interested in.
Tim, you talk mostly about demography, the threats related to demography. But obviously you talk about many threats. So if I can ask your first question, if the giant is going to stumble, where's the most likely source of the threat?
Well, I think the threats all come at different times. I mean, there are threats that China faces today. There are threats that won't arise for several years. And some threats are more serious than others. I mean, I think the environmental threat is enormous. The effect it has on public health and therefore on the economy is becoming bigger and bigger every year and not being attended to. There are regional threats where northern China is the most water-short piece of contiguous land in the world. This is for a number of reasons, partly for natural reasons, that it has less water, but partly because of a socialist economic legacy, people have had very low-cost water and have abused it, overused it, and wasted it. Also, there have been droughts and various things that have exacerbated that. So, as a result, China has deep problems with the resource of water. And China's solution for this has been to say, we control the Tibetan plateau. 7 of the world's largest rivers arise there, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, the Ob in Russia, and so on. We'll divert some of that water so that more of it flows through China. We'll build some canals at considerable expense from the southwest to the northeast to channel that water up to where it's needed. One of the difficulties with this is that China's neighbours are deeply concerned that this diversion of water will affect them. But if the Brahmaputra's water levels go down, if the Ob River in Russia reduces further, it affects navigation. If the Mekong gets lower, it will affect the whole ecology of the Mekong Delta. There are lots of knock-on impacts. And if it becomes very severe, it could lead to regional conflict. Now, we all talk about these rocky islands in the China seas, but I think water is more likely to cause conflict than disputes over territories. And I think that China should give much more consideration to conservation over diversion. When you consider that the biggest use of water in China is agriculture, it uses 70% of all the water use in China every year. And according to the government's figures, 55% of the water used in agriculture is wasted before it gets to the point of use. That's over a third of China's water system every year being lost in one industry alone. I would have thought conservation ought to have higher priority than diverting water from other people. But there are challenges everywhere. It's difficult to say which one will come to the forefront earlier. Okay. But the book's full of challenges.
Okay. Yeah, let's open up for the question from the floor. Yeah, please use the mic over there and identify yourself. Yeah.
Shannon Peng, representing only myself and nobody else. At the start of your talk, you said that you had to change your opinions in writing this book based on further research. Could you highlight some of the changes you had to make?
Well, the best example, I think, is the one-child policy, where it seemed natural that if you bring in a policy to restrict births and then you see births go down, that the policy must have led to the results. I mean, that seems a natural, and I didn't really think about it much further until I actually had to come and study it. And then I started to realize that that was too glib. It was not actually accounting for what we were seeing.
Thank you. Came in also representing myself. I'm sorry I missed the very beginning of your talk, but you've dealt mostly, because of lack of time, I'm sure, with the demographic challenges that China is going to face. I wonder how the Chinese diaspora fits into this. There are millions and millions of Chinese globally, and China does not have the same problems that Japan, for example, has on an aging population and tight immigration laws, or at least, as I see it, the demographic challenge, of course, is a major one, but there's nothing unexpected. It's something that can be foreseen, not just by you, but the Chinese leadership. And I'm sure they are planning to restructure their policies to deal with it. Who knows, perhaps the high pollution rate in the cities will kill off all these men earlier so that they don't cause a problem.
Comment on that?
Well, a number of different points there. One point is, I don't think the leadership has taken on board the research that has been done on the long-term population outlook for China. There aren't very many domestic forecasts, but even the Chinese Family Planning Commission said after President Xi Jinping came out in November with these adjustments in the one-child policy, they came out and said they still expected the fertility rate of China to continue to go down. So I don't think there is a single forecast anywhere that China's population is going to go up. The question is how to cope with the impact of it coming down so much. Now, in certain countries, natalist policies have been adopted to try to encourage people to have more children with subsidies, changes in inheritance laws, all sorts of things. Korea's had some impact on that. Other societies have tried to encourage immigration. But I think in China, there are particular difficulties. For a start, poorer Chinese men likely to be in rural areas, speaking no foreign language, are unlikely to attract tens of millions of foreign wives. And it's distinctly unlikely that they're going to end up marrying a girl from the Philippines or from Vietnam or from somewhere. There is some trafficking of Cambodian, Vietnamese and Burmese women into China. But the people who can buy somebody who's been trafficked are by definition middle class. What we're talking about is tens of millions of very poor Chinese men, and I don't see who they're going to marry. I also don't think that China is a country that is particularly welcoming of large-scale immigration. In the United States, immigration takes two forms. You've got the PhDs in engineering, and you've got people who come in to do laboring work. And immigrants fall into roughly 50-50 in those two categories, about 17 million each. China doesn't want external labor. It has strongly discouraged that. It's encouraged external talent, but the total number of foreigners in China is 600,000. In America, it's 34 million, plus a number of illegal immigrants. So we're looking at a totally different scale. I don't see China suddenly becoming a society that's becoming international, cosmopolitan. China is not as bad as Russia, where a dislike for foreigners is highly apparent amongst wide sections of the society. But clearly a lot of people are not particularly popular in China. I mean, if somebody wins a song contest and they're only half Chinese, there tends to be a lot of criticism on the internet. I don't see quick remedies for China from the demographic issue.
I'll just shout.
Okay.
So, Peter from Silk Road. So you've been speaking about the threats that China faces. So my question is, would you still invest in China, given what you have now researched and know? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, I do invest in China. I mean, I've got 3 businesses there. I don't think it's going to disappear. I don't think it's going to overtake the United States to become a superpower. And those are 2 very different propositions. I think China's rate of growth is going to continue to reduce. And I gave some suggestions as to what it might look like in 20 years' time. That doesn't mean that one can't invest there. There are all sorts of social changes and trends which are very interesting. And in business, you don't have to invest in everything.
Okay, please. Yeah, hi. My name is Lam Chi Chung, and I'm a private equity fund manager. I have two questions. The first is, I think a lot of the challenges you talk about are more longer term in nature. Can you comment on what you see as the shorter term risks? I mean, there have been a lot of talk of the risk of a hard landing because of credit issues, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can give your view on that. Secondly, on the geopolitical issue, I think what you talked about very briefly earlier was the time horizon to 2100. I'm wondering more in terms of a timeline that's around 2125 to 2150, where 2025 to 2050. Over the next 20, 30, 10 to 30 years, because I think most forecasts are for China's GDP, whatever your growth assumptions and the demographic issues, to overtake the United States somewhere in the 2020s or maybe a little bit beyond, and for that gap to widen in spite of the demographic issues over the next few decades. So wouldn't that kind of be an interesting geopolitical issue to focus on regardless of 2100? Thank you.
Yeah, well, again, that's a number of different issues. Let me try and address some of them. Yes, I don't disagree that China's growth rate could cause the total size of China's economy to become bigger than the total size of America's economy at some point. I don't think it'll happen in 2027, as most of the forecasts have it, because I see the growth rate of China continuing to slow. But I think that it's quite possible by the 2030s that may happen. But of course, what we'd be looking at is a whole lot of poor people in a country whose total output is the same as a smaller number of richer people. And what does that mean? It still may mean a society that can't afford to have welfare and armaments. So if China doesn't introduce some kind of social security system, I think there's a danger of severe instability in the country. I think it may be difficult to have social security and a global military projection, because the ability to fund things is going to become less easy rather than more easy in 20 years' time. So there are various aspects to this. I think that China's total debt is a serious issue. I think it's much bigger than people forecast. I think it's higher than America's debt as a percentage of GDP. That we know not enough about the nature and makeup and risk of it because the data are so unclear. But there are severe risks in the banking system in China. There are risks to government finance. And China may manage to get through this. In the past, it was able to grow through problems because the economy was growing well enough to enable growth to account for debt. As the economy slows down, it's harder to grow through problems of debt. So I just raise that because it makes the risks in the Chinese economy more than they used to be. Another example may be interesting because it's another argument that I would use in terms of the dysfunctionality of China's financial system, which is people tend to look at the foreign exchange reserves of China, $3.9 trillion, and say, well, whatever happens to China, at least they've got these huge foreign exchange reserves that will enable them to bail out any severe problems. What it tends to overlook is how you create foreign exchange reserves. all know that you get foreign exchange reserves because you intervene in the foreign exchange market, you sell your currency and buy foreign currency to try and stabilize the rates. Okay. We know that Chinese companies export more than they import, so foreign exchange is accumulated. It's sold to the central bank at the end of the year. So the central bank gets all this foreign exchange. That's fine. But in both cases, it had to pay for it with local currency. Now, where did China get 3.9 trillion US dollars worth of local currency? It didn't just go and print it. It's accumulated it. It didn't exist in 1978. Where that money came from is essentially from two sources. One is China now has the fourth largest bond market in the world. It issues bonds to Chinese financial institutions, to the Chinese public. Also, all banks that operate in China have to place prudential reserves with the central bank. And that's perfectly normal. The central bank has a huge amount of prudential reserves. Together, those account for most of that 3.9 trillion, which has then been used to accumulate foreign exchange. So you can say that China's got $3.9 trillion of foreign assets, but it's got something in excess of $3 trillion of domestic debt, which at some point will need to be repaid. Now, I would suggest that doesn't make China the strongest country in the world. It makes, if you want to treat it lightly, you could say it makes China resemble the largest undiversified currency hedge fund in the world. Because it's betting on currencies that it has no control over, with money borrowed in its own currency. I think it's the situation which will need to be unraveled, and earlier rather than later. And interestingly, that number is identical to the $3.9 trillion that the United States has used in quantitative easing, which again is a situation that will need to be unraveled. And again, we don't know the consequences. We don't know the costs of doing that.
I want to replay that hard landing thing.
I'm sorry?
The question on hard landing.
Hard landing. Really hard. I mean, this seems to be a question that comes up about every 18 months. Hard landing, soft landing. I mean, basically, it's muddled landings that you tend to get in China all the time. I'm not forecasting that China's going to collapse, but you have a lot of policy problems in there which have to be accounted for, and quite what the consequences would be year by year by year, it is not that easy to tell. It depends on so many other factors that are going on in the world. What I'm drawing attention to is the larger risks within the system, which need to be reduced. China needs to take steps to de-risk its financial and economic situation. Year by year, whether you get hard landings, soft landings, depend on the whole global macro environment, which is changing all the time.
Oh, hi, my name is Xu Wei. I'm a businessman. Just now you mentioned urbanization has very significant effect on the decline of birth rate, and yet China is launching an enormous wave of urbanization as the engine of its economic growth. So, and also Singapore government has also embarked on certain projects like the Tianjin Eco-City project with China to tap onto certain industries such as sustainable urban development and environmental technologies. So do you think Singapore is going in the right direction, and in your opinion, what are the potential risks Singapore must be aware of?
Well, the whole urbanization strategy of China is fraught with risk in a number of different directions. I mean, a massive drive to urbanization has high environmental risk, because it concentrates pollution in specific areas. It also creates an environment that is more conducive to crime, more conducive to social and physical diseases, suicides, mental disease, which are all on the rise in China. They're also reducing China's arable land. And China is very short of arable land, and a lot of the fertile land is being urbanized. And of course, under the sort of rules that China operates by, if a locality uses arable land for real estate development, it has to find the same amount of land somewhere else. And what's happening is the same amount of land is being found, but in ever more remote and extreme locations, on mountainsides, on ice tundra. I mean, it means that China is having less and less fertile land. It's using more and more fertilizer to produce some kind of yield from that land, which is then poisoning rivers and also having an effect on the coastal waters, building up hypnoxia and eutropia. In other words, all these red tides and dead zones off the coast of China. So there are lots and lots of perverse consequences from urbanization. One of the reasons that I think there is for China's obsession with urbanization is that since at least the mid-19th century, the elite in China has had a disdain for rural life. And you see that in the vocabulary in Chinese of how you describe farmers, looming. I mean, you see it in so many things. Since at least the 19th century, whenever a senior official retires from his post in Beijing or Shanghai or somewhere, they do not go back and live in the villages and towns that they originated from. They stay in the cities because there is an institutionalized disdain for rural life, which we don't have in Western Europe, for example, where General Charles de Gaulle retires as President of France and goes and lives in his village and is very happy, he likes it. This is normal. But in China, there's a contempt for the countryside. And that is one of the reasons for this drive for urbanization at all costs and the perverse consequences that arise from it. What I would suggest, it might be a better investment for China to invest in rural life and improve the quality of small towns and villages across China instead of encouraging everybody to go and live in cities, which are becoming out of control.
But like the recent collaboration aims to produce a superior model which can be replicated elsewhere in China, making use of very barren land like salt marshland to build a city with minimum environmental footprint. Do you think such a model creates opportunity for foreign investment?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, China is such a big place. I mean, you can do some things well. I'm merely talking about the broad trend. Yes, I mean, if Singapore can find a good investment in an environmentally attractive city development, by all means, it could be successful. I'm just saying that the scale of urbanization in China is too big to be in China's long-term interest, and it has too many perverse consequences. But I'm sure there are lots of attractive ecologically friendly projects, although the history of environmentally friendly projects in China has been littered with failure. You see that in the island off Shanghai, you see that up in the north. There are a whole series of environmental projects that have simply failed, sometimes for reasons of bureaucracy, sometimes for bad planning reasons. But no, if there's a good project, it might well be a great success.
Thank you.
Name is Jan Shikchuan, one-time stockbroker. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation. I thought there was quite a bit of pessimism in your remarks, the discouraging demographics, the dysfunctional financial system, lack of creativity, and so on. So I was sitting there thinking that, you know, there must be some silver lining there. And what, I'll just pick on two, otherwise I'll be spending too much time. Gaming over there just now talked about the diaspora. There are a lot of linkages, not just one way, but two ways, okay? I recently met a gentleman, he's not world famous like Li Ka-shing, I just met a gentleman from Sydney. He went to Sydney when he was in his 20s, didn't speak English. And I met him recently. His name is George Wang. And during the Lehman-induced great global financial crisis, a lot of Australian institutions went bust, including MacArthur. And he brought up MacArthur. But more interestingly, he has now started, I mean, it's very difficult, for example, for someone to start up a stock exchange in Singapore. But and Australia is actually has a bit of a fortress mentality. But Australia has allowed him, George Wang, to start up an Asia-Pacific exchange. And what he's going to do, because of the China restricted IPOs, they're only gradually opening it up again. If you're not a big state-owned company, you join a queue, or you go to Hong Kong, or you go to AIMS, or you go to Singapore. So now he's encouraging them to go to Australia. It's a long haul, but he's making a start. And China is actually applauding his success, saying that this is a guy who went to Australia with no advantages. He was not a princeling. He didn't go there with bags of money. Okay? The other point I want to talk on is you mentioned the lack of creativity. Yeah? I am fortunate that I actually got to know someone who was the head of research and development at Huawei, which is a world-famous company. And he actually went on to work with Robin Lee as Chief Technological Officer at Baidu. Okay? The example I want to give is that my wife was thinking of changing her smartphone. And she had heard about this company in China called Xiaomi. All right? And this is only like a year ago. And this friend of mine who is he's never been educated outside China. He's a local Chinese, all right? He said, no. Xiaomi is nothing. Buy Apple. He said, you'll be much happier with buying Apple. But today, in the space of 12 months, Xiaomi has really transformed itself by focusing on the user, saying that, all right, we have this duopoly, we have the Samsung, we have the Apple. What are they not providing the user? And it's spreading very fast around the world. All right? And if you go to Africa today, one of the largest increasing population of mobile users, there are a lot of Chinese phones maybe I'll just end with an example. Facebook, we all know Facebook, right? They paid $19 billion for WhatsApp, right?
Okay.
WhatsApp is backward, all right? I stand corrected because I'm not, I don't know, but basically WhatsApp is a messaging service. It wants to go into voice, but if you go to Tencent's WeChat, it already has voice, it already has video, and it's also social media. People use it to network among themselves. And I put it that actually the rise of social media in Singapore, in China, although monitored and restricted, is going to have great positive developments for the development of China.
Okay, thank you. You want to comment?
Sure. Where shall I start? I think I'll go back to one of my first points when I stood up, which is to say there are lots of good things in China and lots of bad things in China because China is a very large place. There are lots of examples I can give you of innovation in China. Low-cost space technology, 3D laser printing, supercomputers, telecoms, Huawei. Lots of things like that. A lot of them are state-driven projects rather than private sector-driven, but China does quite a lot of things quite well. But in the overall scale of things, China has failed at innovation. The examples are not as many of success as they are of lack of success. 83% of all China's high-tech exports are produced by foreign companies operating in China using their technology. So What we need is more success by Chinese companies. So I'm not denying that there are lots of examples, but there are 1.4 billion people in China, and overall it's not doing what it should. That was really my point.
Okay, Phil.
Thank you. I think we must know our own weaknesses, and China was backward in the last 100 years, all because we know that it was too self-conceited before. If we have people like you to point it out, all these threats 100 years ago, perhaps the whole history will change. Now, I would like to ask, knowing also much threats facing China now, if you were the administrators, the government in China, what are your suggestions in order of priorities to mitigate all these problems?
Yeah, it would be to take the steps that can be taken to mitigate the insoluble demographic challenge, and I'll go into that, and it'll be to solve the things that can be solved, which is to clean up the environment and reduce the cost to public health on a large scale that is currently taking place. It's to produce a more optimized financial system, to encourage the commercial banks to lend to the fastest growing parts of the economy, the private sector, not to the slower growing parts, which are the state enterprises, to encourage the authorities to allow more listings by private companies on the stock exchanges of China, instead of making it very, very hard for private companies to launch on the stock exchange. Because we need more capital to go to those parts of the Chinese economy that can keep growing. And we need to get rid of the dysfunctionality. This is one of the critical things. We need to clean up the environment, and we need to think, how can we live with the insoluble problem of demographic crisis? And I use the word crisis because no other country is going to face what China is going to face between now and 2100. It's not only having a reducing population, but in a background where the per capita income has not got to the levels of Japan. We're not talking about a rich society, but a relatively poor society going through wrenching demographic change. And we have to have policies that will ameliorate and mitigate those impacts, because they cannot be eradicated. We are going to have to live with that in China and make the best of it that we can. But we can deal with innovation. We can make China more innovative. If Chinese people can be successful in Silicon Valley, they have to be allowed to be successful in China. And that, I suggest, means changing the culture of science and the culture of education. So there are lots of things that can be done. It just requires political will, and it also requires some degree of money. And of course, the funding is easier while the economy is growing at 7%. It'll be a lot harder when the economy is growing at 2%.
Okay, please, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a student at Tang Trust School here in Singapore. From what I understood from your talk, domestic consumption isn't a long-term way forward for China's growth. So therefore, do you think that large export-led growth is sustainable, considering many large economies like the UK and the USA are trying to reduce their dependency on imports and improve their own manufacturing and domestic consumption?
Well, I think that the whole export model is endangered by a rising cost base, which is partly long-term double-digit rises in wages, but also, of course, the cost of pollution. I mean, if foreign companies are going to say, my staff want a premium to work in China because the pollution is so bad, which is beginning to happen now, it just all raises the cost of doing business in China. If land costs are getting more and more expensive, social charges are coming in, taxation really needs to be reformed in China because China undercollects tax. We really need a more efficient tax system. That means people have got to start paying more tax. All of these increase the cost of doing business. I think that exports can't be the principal driver in the long term, low-cost exports. We've got to get to higher quality products that use less labor. We've got a world where there's going to be fewer Chinese workers, higher wage costs. China's got to start producing higher quality product. And that can be done. It just means fostering a culture of innovation.
But isn't that what's so attractive about Chinese export, is their low price? So if they do intend to increase the price, wouldn't that...
But they're not going to stay low priced.
The gentleman over there. Yeah, you.
I'm just curious, in your deep research on China, in 1850, China's population peaked at 430 million, and it continued to decline until 1911, where it did not reach that peak yet. So historically, in the last 200 years, China has seen a population base that's gone from 430 million to maybe a trough of about 360, and then it doubled from 1911 until now. It's more than doubled, right? So how does that period of Chinese history, what lessons does that have for you in your thesis about demographics? That's question number one. Question number two, a lot of the points that you have mentioned, right? If I sit back 20 years ago, I remember reading a book called The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon Chang, is a book I kind of regretted reading because, I missed out on the bull market in China, right? A lot of the factors that you mentioned today, you would have used those same reasoning 20 years ago. There will still be the same factors. But yet, in the last 25 years, the country has done something different.
Right. First of all, when people were having very high population growth in China, it was against a background of high infant mortality. People had a lot of children because they lost a lot of children. And they didn't have a consumer lifestyle. And they didn't have high real estate prices. What I suggest today is if you scrap the one-child policy tomorrow, people are simply not going to go out and have 5 children. It's not the 19th century again. Those days have gone. They will not return. That's just a fact. The reason why birth rates in Shanghai are about 0.7 per family isn't because there's a law of having 1. It's because people want 0.7. That is not going to change. So we just got to get used to the fact the world isn't where it was in the 19th century. Now, Gordon Chang's book, I joke about it in my book. If you read his book, it doesn't raise the issues that my book raises. I don't think he talks about demography at all. I don't think that's occurred to him. His book is about thinking that the Communist Party is going to collapse, the economy is going to collapse. It's all this kind of stuff. And it was obviously wrong. But he doesn't talk about the issues that I raise. We're not in the same game. And I'm not talking about the coming collapse of China, because I'm not forecasting that. I'm forecasting that it won't replace the United States as the next superpower. That is not the same as forecasting a coming collapse.
Okay, maybe this is the last one.
My name is Baek Kyung-woon. My question is actually related to your last comment, and that is, do you see this internal security problems as one of the threats to China, and do you see the Communist Party of China continuing to be the leading light in China?
The Communist Party of China, since 1978, has been extraordinarily adaptive. It's a non-ideological organization. It has no views ideologically. It wants to stay in power, like any group of politicians anywhere in the world. And it takes steps to try and ensure that it will stay in power. But I don't think you can really point to any economic or social policy that's communist or even socialist about the Communist Party. They've been highly successful. In the 80s and the 90s, China was the fastest reforming country in the world. But from the year 2000 until now, there have been virtually no reforms whatever in China. And I would suggest that's because reforms that were required became tougher and tougher. They had a higher and higher political price, and yet the leaders in charge of China had less and less authority and charisma to drive through changes. And the two things happening together meant that reform just stopped. And the question now is Xi Jinping going to have the courage and the ability to drive through major reforms that clearly China needs? Not just the ones he outlined in November, but the real ones that China is going to have to bite on if it's going to reform itself. Now, I think Xi Jinping would like to reform, but unfortunately China is not a dictatorship. It's run by several hundred, if not over 1,000, important people who have a say in policy. And I'm not sure that the system as it stands is going to enable Xi Jinping to reform China to the extent that it needs to reform to be highly successful in the future. That's the problem I see. I mean, I think he wants to do the right kind of stuff. I'm not sure he's going to be able to do it.
Well, on that note, maybe we can stop here and by thanking the speaker.